In March of 2025, a team of scientists claimed they had found something underneath the pyramids of Giza that should not be possible. Not a tomb, not a hidden room, a city. 8 massive cylindrical shafts, plunging more than 600 meters into solid rock, wrapped in spiral staircases that descend into total darkness, connected to chambers large enough to swallow a football stadium whole. For a few days in March, this was the biggest story on the internet. Then the world's most respected Egyptologists stepped forward and said, bluntly, that it was fake. So what actually happened beneath the sand, and why does this specific shape, a dark spiral shaft descending into the earth, keep showing up in humanity's oldest and most frightening stories? That is what we are going to untangle today. To understand why this claim spread so fast, you first need to understand how much we genuinely do not know about Giza. Even after 2 centuries of serious archaeology, the Giza plateau was built over roughly 100 years during Egypt's 4th dynasty, under the pharaohs Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. The Great Pyramid alone contains an estimated 2.3 million blocks of stone, some weighing more than 70 tons, assembled without a single crane or piece of iron machinery that we know of. For almost 4,000 years, it was the tallest structure ever built by human beings, a record that stood until Lincoln Cathedral was completed in England in the 14th century. Despite all of that engineering being fully documented and understood in broad strokes, there are still real, unresolved questions about the site. Why this precise alignment with the cardinal points? Why this exact location on the plateau? And whether anything remains buried beneath structures we have already spent 200 years studying. That gap between what is proven and what is still unknown is exactly the space where extraordinary claims tend to grow. The story of this particular claim does not start in 2025. It starts in 2022, when 2 European researchers, Corrado Malanga, a retired chemistry professor from the University of Pisa in Italy, and Filippo Biondi, affiliated with the University of Strathclyde in Scotland, published a study claiming they had used a technology called synthetic aperture radar, or SAR, to see structures inside the Great Pyramid without digging at all. Their method, in theory, worked by processing radar signals bounced off the pyramid from orbiting satellites and cross-referencing them with tiny natural vibrations moving through the structure, essentially trying to build a 3-dimensional picture out of motion data rather than a direct scan. Radar specialists were skeptical from the start because this class of satellite radar is built to map surfaces, not to see hundreds of meters through dense limestone. Still, the paper circulated, picked up attention in alternative archaeology circles, and the 2 names stayed on the radar, so to speak, of anyone following fringe Egyptology. The real explosion came 3 years later. In March of 2025, now operating under the name the Coffer Project, with a spokesperson named Nicole Cicolo handling communications and Egyptologist Armando May joining the team, the group called an international press conference. They announced what they described as one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in modern history. Using the same SAR-based method, they claim to have mapped a vast underground network stretching roughly 2 kilometers beneath all 3 pyramids of Giza. Near the base of the Khafre pyramid, specifically, they described 5 identical structures, each with 5 internal levels and a sloped ceiling, connected by geometric passageways. Beneath those, 8 hollow cylindrical shafts, encircled by spiral staircases, descending to depths reported anywhere between 600 and nearly 700 meters, depending on the version of the claim. At the very bottom, they described 2 massive cube-shaped chambers, each roughly 80 meters on a side, large enough to hold a football stadium inside each one. Malanga went further in public statements, suggesting that when the images were refined, they would reveal what could only be called a genuine underground city, potentially connected to legends like the Hall of Records. The claim spread with extraordinary speed. Political figures commented on it publicly. History and mystery channels around the world picked it up within days. For roughly a week, Giza was one of the most discussed topics on the internet, and it is not hard to understand why. The idea touches almost everything people find irresistible. Lost civilizations, hidden knowledge, the possibility that we do not know our own past as well as we think we do. But the scientific response arrived almost as quickly as the claim itself, and it was blunt. Zahi Hawass, arguably the most recognizable Egyptologist alive and Egypt's former Minister of Antiquities, did not soften his language. He called the claims fabrications and fake news, stating plainly that no radar technology had been authorized to operate inside or near the Coffer Pyramid, and that Egypt's Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities had never granted permission for this kind of study at the site. He pointed out that neither Malanga nor Biondi had ever actually traveled to Egypt to conduct fieldwork there. He also noted that the Coffer Pyramid has already been studied extensively for decades, with clear evidence that much of the structure was carved directly into the plateau's natural bedrock, which does not match the kind of open cylindrical shafts being described. Other Egyptian antiquities officials echoed him, with one museum director in Alexandria describing the claims as falling somewhere between exaggeration and outright deception. Hawass was not the only expert to weigh in. Lawrence Conyers, a professor at the University of Denver and one of the most respected authorities in the world on ground-penetrating radar, called the claims a massive exaggeration. His objection was rooted in basic physics. Electromagnetic waves lose strength rapidly as they pass through dense material, which makes it extremely unlikely that any radar technique, satellite-based or otherwise, could produce detailed readings hundreds of meters down through solid rock. This is not a matter of opinion or interpretation. It is a known limitation of how radar interacts with stone. To be fair to the researchers, Conyers did leave a small door open. He noted that modest natural cavities, far smaller than what the Coffer Project described, could plausibly exist beneath the plateau, and pointed out that other ancient cultures, including the Maya in Mesoamerica, often built pyramids directly over caves or natural voids that were already considered sacred before construction began. A small natural cavity is plausible. An entire underground city, complete with staircases and stadium-sized chambers, is a different category of claim entirely. It is worth pausing on why the 2022 paper gave the later claims a veneer of legitimacy, because the distinction matters more than most coverage let on. That earlier, peer-reviewed study did not claim to see directly through solid stone like an X-ray machine. It analyzed tiny natural seismic vibrations moving through the Great Pyramid and used mathematical modeling to infer possible internal features from those motion patterns, an approach its own authors described as experimental and indirect. That is a fundamentally different, much more limited, claim than photographing a stadium-sized chamber 600 meters underground. But once a technique has appeared in a legitimate journal, it becomes very easy for far more ambitious follow-up claims to borrow its credibility, even when the leap between the two is enormous. With enough data processing, faint or ambiguous signals can start to resemble structure that simply is not there, which is part of why independent replication and peer review exist in the first place. Several additional problems compounded the skepticism. The raw data behind the Coffer Project's claims was never made publicly available for independent analysis. The research was never submitted through formal peer review, the process by which independent experts examine methodology before a finding is accepted by the broader scientific community. Without that step, what exists is technically an assertion, not a validated discovery. Fact-checkers who investigated the story afterward found something else worth noting. One of the most widely shared images used to illustrate the discovery, a dramatic cross-section showing the pyramid and the alleged structures beneath it, was run through an AI detection tool and came back with a near certain probability of being artificially generated, rather than a real scientific visualization. On top of that, further digging revealed that Corrado Malanga has spent decades as a public figure in UFO research, with repeated television appearances discussing alien contact and abduction theories. None of that alone disproves any specific finding, but it substantially raised the level of scrutiny the claims were held to. The story did not end with the March announcement. In June of 2025, the same team announced a second hidden structure beneath the plateau, this time tied to alleged water erosion marks on blocks near the Great Pyramid, hinting at some kind of ancient flood event. Hawass responded again, once more demanding peer-reviewed data that never materialized. Then, months later, came a third chapter, the announcement of an L-shaped artifact buried roughly 2 meters underground near Giza's western necropolis. This claim was far more modest, and unlike the underground city, technically within the plausible range of what ground-penetrating radar can actually detect. Even so, it has not been confirmed by any independent excavation to date. A clear pattern took shape across all three announcements: a dramatic claim, global media attention, a firm scientific denial, and no physical confirmation ever following. It would be unfair, though, to suggest that nothing real has ever been found beneath or within the pyramids using modern technology, because something genuinely has, just on a far more modest scale than an underground city. Since 2015, a serious international collaboration called Scan Pyramids, involving French, Japanese, and Egyptian institutions, has used a technique called muography. This method relies on muons, subatomic particles that constantly rain down from cosmic rays and are able to pass through solid rock, losing energy in ways that can be measured and mapped, similar in principle to how an X-ray passes through soft tissue, but is blocked more by bone. In 2017, this project confirmed the existence of a large void inside the Great Pyramid, more than 30 meters long, sitting above the Grand Gallery. That finding was published in the peer-reviewed journal Nature and was widely accepted by the scientific community. In the years since, the same muon-based technique has identified a handful of smaller corridors and cavities within the pyramid structure. The difference between this and the underground city claim is not subtle. One is a credible, peer-reviewed, still not fully explained void. The other is a claim of an entire buried civilization complete with stadium-sized rooms. Both involve something hidden. They belong to completely different categories of believability. And yet, even without any proof, even after categorical public rejection from the world's leading Egyptologists, the specific image the Coffer Project put into the world kept spreading. Deep vertical shafts, wrapped in spiral staircases, descending into total darkness beneath the desert. That image did not fade with the controversy. It kept resurfacing, and eventually it collided with a much older story, one that has nothing to do with satellites or radar and everything to do with a nearly 2,000-year-old religious text most people have never read. There is a book left out of almost every modern edition of the Bible that describes something unsettlingly close to what the Coffer Project claimed to have found. It is called the Book of Enoch, likely written sometime between the 3rd and 1st centuries before Christ, and attributed to the biblical figure Enoch, who, according to Genesis, walked with God and was taken to heaven without ever dying. The book is not part of the official canon for most Jewish and Christian traditions today, but it is still considered scripture by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, proof that it circulated seriously within ancient religious communities. What Enoch describes is oddly specific, and it is hard not to notice the resemblance to the architecture the Coffer Project alleged. According to the text, 200 angels known as the Watchers descended to Mount Hermon, a mountain range spanning what is now Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. They corrupted themselves, took human wives, and taught humanity forbidden knowledge, including metalworking, weapon-making, cosmetics, and astrology. Their union with humans supposedly produced a race of giants called the Nephilim, mentioned much more briefly in the book of Genesis itself. The punishment came by direct divine order carried out by the archangel Raphael. One of the leading watchers, a figure named Azazel, is bound hand and foot and thrown into darkness. An opening is made in the desert, and he is cast inside it covered with sharp, jagged rocks, condemned to remain in the dark until a final day of judgment, when he will finally be cast into fire. A vertical opening in the desert, sealed and isolated, essentially a shaft engineered specifically to hold something far from the light. That image is not confined to Jewish tradition either. In the New Testament, in the second letter attributed to Peter, there is a single Greek word used exactly once in the entire original text, Tartarus. The passage describes God not sparing the angels who sinned, but casting them into Tartarus, delivering them into chains of darkness to be held until judgment. Tartarus is not a Hebrew or Christian term at all. It is borrowed directly from Greek mythology. In the tradition described by poets like Hesiod, Tartarus is a pit as far beneath the earth as the sky is. Above it, a cosmic prison reserved specifically for beings too powerful to simply be destroyed. It is where Zeus imprisoned the Titans after defeating them for control of the universe. Two traditions, born in completely different cultural worlds, one Near Eastern and Semitic, the other Hellenic and Greek, arriving independently at the same central image, a deep, dark, vertical abyss, purpose-built to contain rebellious divine beings. That is precisely the image the alleged shafts beneath Coffer evoke, with their spiraling descent hundreds of meters into rock, far from any light. Before that connection starts to feel too convenient, it is worth returning to Egypt itself and asking what the Egyptians actually believed existed underground, because their answer is at least as rich, and arguably far more historically relevant than any biblical or Greek parallel. In Egyptian religion, the underworld is called the Duat, a subterranean realm divided into regions and gates through which the sun god Ra traveled every night in his solar barge, facing serpents, demons, and trials, before being reborn at the following dawn. Safely crossing the Duat required knowing passwords, spells, and the exact name of every gatekeeper at every threshold, knowledge recorded in what we now call the Book of the Dead, buried with mummies for millennia, as a literal survival manual for the soul. The Duat is not described as a prison for rebellious beings the way Tartarus or Enoch's Abyss are, but it is unmistakably a space of gates, guardians, and dangerous passages, another ancient tradition in which descending means confronting, testing, or containing something powerful. If structures like the ones alleged under Coffer are ever actually confirmed, their function may have far less to do with imprisoning fallen angels and far more to do with physically representing Ra's journey through the Duat, a ceremonial space of descent, symbolic death and rebirth, built by a civilization that treated architecture as an extension of its cosmology. What makes this even more striking is that this pattern is not limited to the Mediterranean world at all. Across the ocean in Mesoamerica, the Maya described Xibalba, the underworld, accessed through caves and natural vertical openings in limestone called cenotes, geologically similar notably to the kind of terrain that makes up the Giza plateau itself. According to the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Quiché Maya, lords of death test and imprison those who descend into Xibalba through a series of trial chambers, a narrative structure strikingly similar to the Egyptian journey through the Duat. In Mesopotamia, older even than Pyramid-era Egypt, the Sumerians described the Abzu, a subterranean freshwater ocean associated with the god Enki, guardian of wisdom, and, in some accounts, a force that contained primordial chaos before the ordered world was created. In Hindu tradition, texts like the Bhagavata Purana describe lower realms called Patala, where certain powerful beings, Nagas and some Asuras among them, are kept away from the surface world across a system of multiple subterranean levels, a structure that echoes, oddly, the 5 stacked horizontal levels the Coffer Project claimed to have found beneath Khafre's pyramid. None of these cultures had any documented contact with each other in antiquity. The Quiché of Guatemala, the Sumerians of Mesopotamia, and the authors of Hindu scripture never exchanged a single text, legend, or word between them. And yet, independently, each of them arrived at the same basic architectural conclusion. The dangerous, the sacred, and the forbidden belong underground, and the path to reach them is always a descent. This is not proof of some shared hidden truth behind all these myths. Anthropologists and comparative mythologists, Joseph Campbell most famously among them, documented this kind of symbolic repetition across world cultures decades ago, and the most widely accepted explanation is not supernatural at all. It is psychological and environmental. Caves, wells, and cracks in the rock were, quite literally, the only truly dark and unknown spaces available to ancient humans anywhere on the planet. It should not be surprising that, in nearly every part of the world, those spaces became the natural setting for whatever a culture feared or revered most. The specific link between the alleged structures at Giza and the imprisonment of fallen angels did not originate in any temple, any traditional religious text, or any serious Egyptological research. It was assembled online, in real time, the moment the Coffer Project's claims began circulating. It is not difficult to understand why that particular combination caught on so quickly. An unproven, sensational archaeological claim with a geometry that evokes an abyss, combined with an obscure biblical myth just unfamiliar enough to feel like secret knowledge. The result is a story practically engineered to spread because it simultaneously satisfies scientific curiosity, religious fascination, and the very old human appetite for a hidden secret finally being revealed. This is not even the first time similar connections have been drawn around Giza. Decades before the Coffer Project, authors of alternative history literature already linked the pyramids to portals, dimensional prisons, and pre-flood civilizations, with figures like Zecharia Sitchin proposing theories about the Anunnaki, which he interpreted as ancient Sumerian deities, in a reading widely rejected by actual specialists in Assyriology and ancient Near Eastern languages. The pattern repeats generation after generation, an ambiguous finding, an ancient myth, and a public connecting the two, sometimes poetically, often while ignoring the original historical context of the texts involved entirely. That raises a more honest question than simply asking whether angels are imprisoned beneath Egypt. Why are people so drawn to this specific idea in the first place, the notion of something powerful and dangerous being kept locked away at the bottom of the earth? The answer is almost certainly older than any pyramid. Nearly every human culture has, at some point in its history, produced its own version of the same core narrative. A force beyond human control is too dangerous to remain free, and so it must be contained, isolated, and buried. Prometheus chained to a mountain in Greek myth, Loki bound until the end of time in Norse mythology, the Titans locked in Tartarus, the Watchers cast into the abyss, according to Enoch. It functions almost like a universal archetype, repeated across cultures that never had any direct contact with one another. The idea that something too large, too dangerous, is being kept far from the light, waiting. That may be exactly why the story of cylinders beneath Giza caught fire the way it did. It activates that ancient archetype, even in people who have never heard of the Book of Enoch in their lives. The shape itself, a deep, dark, spiraling shaft, already carries enormous symbolic weight before any scientific or mythological explanation is even attached to it. There's a second ingredient to this fascination, arguably even more powerful than the first, the idea that the truth was deliberately kept from us. It is not simply that something dangerous exists underground. It is that something dangerous exists underground, and at some point, someone decided ordinary people should not know about it. This kind of narrative surrounds ancient Egypt constantly, from priests guarding secrets inside sealed temples to pharaohs supposedly carrying forbidden knowledge into their own sarcophagi. It fits perfectly with a distrust of institutions that long predates the internet, the sense that authorities, whether religious, political, or scientific, always know more than they reveal. That same ingredient explains why Hawass's firm public denial, rather than ending the discussion, in many cases had the opposite effect. For part of the audience, an emphatic official rejection became just another chapter in the story, almost read as confirmation that something needed to be hidden quickly. This is a well-documented pattern in how these kinds of theories spread. The stronger and faster the public denial, the more fuel it paradoxically provides to people already inclined to distrust the official version. That does not mean the denial is wrong. In this specific case, the technical objections raised by radar specialists are sound and independently verifiable. But it helps explain why, instead of cooling off, this controversy only grew larger throughout the rest of 2025. So where does that leave us, honestly? The physical existence of the cylinders and chambers claimed by the Coffer Project remains entirely unconfirmed by any credible scientific process. No excavation has been authorized, no raw data has been released for independent review. The most respected names in Egyptology and in radar geophysics have rejected the claims point by point, based on well-documented technical limitations, not personal opinion. Even if structures of some kind are eventually confirmed through actual excavation, there is currently no archaeological, textual, or linguistic evidence connecting 4th dynasty Egyptian construction to any biblical narrative written more than 2,000 years later, in a culture geographically distant and with no documented direct contact with the pyramid builders. What genuinely exists is a coincidence of form. The same deep vertical shaft that human beings, repeatedly and across unrelated cultures, associate symbolically with containing whatever is dangerous, sacred, or simply too large for the ordinary world. That is not proof of anything supernatural buried under the Egyptian desert. It is, however, a genuinely fascinating demonstration of how the human mind keeps returning to the same symbols, the same fears, and the same narrative solutions, no matter how far apart in time and geography those cultures actually are. Maybe the most interesting discovery in this entire story is not something waiting underneath the Coffer Pyramid at all. Maybe it is the fact that across centuries and civilizations, with zero contact with one another, human beings keep inventing the same story with the same central image to deal with the same old fear that somewhere, something exists that is simply too large for us to control. What we are left with is an unproven archaeological claim colliding with one of the most obscure corners of ancient religious tradition, held together by a symbol old enough to have outlived the need for any proof at all. Does that mean there is nothing real down there? Not necessarily. It means no one has proven that there is. And in that space between nothing is there, and it is literally a biblical prison, lies a large, genuine territory of real mystery. The same territory where archaeology, myth, and imagination have always met, long before any satellite, any radar system, or any viral headline existed. Egyptian archaeology has taught us more than once not to dismiss mysteries too quickly, and also not to confuse the desire to believe with actual proof. Tutankhamun's so-called secret chamber, searched for over decades based on theories many considered wild speculation, eventually became the subject of serious radar investigations, decades after his tomb was first discovered, without ultimately confirming any new hidden rooms. On the other hand, the void above the Grand Gallery was dismissed by many as a fringe idea, right up until it was confirmed with real scientific rigor in 2017. The line between empty speculation and correct intuition is almost always only visible in hindsight, never in advance. If a genuine excavation ever takes place beneath the Giza plateau, and if something real is found down there, it will be reported the same way the story deserves to be told, with a clear line between what has been proven, what has only been claimed, and what remains. For now, one of the oldest and most captivating mysteries human beings have ever told about themselves. If you want to keep digging into the real archaeology behind the myths, hit subscribe, because we cover stories exactly like this one every week, separating what has actually been proven from what is still just a claim. And if you have a theory about what, if anything, is really down there, drop it in the comments. I read every single one.